Okay, so today we are going to set up a fireball spell for the Flayed Mage. To begin, we need to actually add a couple components to the Flayed minion, or to the mage itself. So the first one is Projectile Agent. Projectile Agent allows us to aim. So we add this to an AI when we want it to aim at a target. There's a couple settings here. You can ignore sign and sign multiplier for now. This is actually going to be moved to a different script. What this does is it adds a sign wave to the aiming so that it goes up and down. The important ones is flip towards target, which will tell the character to face towards its target. So if the player's over here, this character will actually turn around and look at it. We're going to turn that on. And then the flip threshold is, it tells it when to flip. So like, let's say the player is standing right on top of the Flayed Mage. It actually won't flicker and flip because there's 0.5 meters of threshold. The next component we're going to add is called Health Router. Health Router doesn't have anything that needs to be configured. However, it is important for any enemy that will do damage. And since this enemy can shoot fireballs and damage the player, we need a Health Router so that it can communicate damage accordingly. So those are the two components that we need to set this up. And we also need one final one, which is called the Infinitive Weapon Handler. So the Infinitive Weapon Handler has a couple things that we need to configure. What this does is it allows us to hold or configure weapons for a character. So one of the first ones we're going to configure is the weapon attachment slot, which is a transform within the hierarchy. So what we're going to do is we're going to locate this, let's see, is this it right here? I'm curious, what is this? This is the Magic Circle Fire Fade. And this is the actual graphic, I think. So this has an animator. So I'm trying to figure out which one we want to use. Interesting. Oh, maybe this is how we control that. Anyway, we're going to go to the animation. We're going to see if this is the one that moves. So fireball full. We can see that it's turning some things on and off. Okay, I see. So the interesting thing is we want to associate that. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to create an empty object here. And we'll call this weapon attachment. And I'm actually going to call this slot 0 in case we want to add more weapon attachments in the future. So I'm going to do that. And then, this won't let me move it. So what we're going to also do is we're going to apply this to the Mage Flayed Minion prefab. And then let's jump in here and move this out. Okay, cool. And, oops. You can see this is at the bottom. We're actually going to move this up to the center. Now my goal was to attach it to one of these objects, but it seems like these turn on and off, and I don't want this to conflict. So I'm going to stick it in the middle of this. Let's round this number out. That's good enough. So this will be where the weapon attaches. And so this isn't a traditional gun, so we're not going to be adding a graphic to it. So this will just be a blank weapon, but now we can save that. We could have finished configuring it in the prefab mode, but we'll just do it here. Oops, wrong one. We want to put this in the weapon attachment. We're not going to set a slot configurator, so we need to also set an initial weapon, but we'll do that in a second. So let's apply this to the prefab. And now our character should be configured correctly. Okay, so the next step is adding the fireball spell. So we've already created one for the nun. So let's take a look at this and see how it works. So like I said, this weapon is actually invisible. There is no need to have a graphic. In fact, this graphic here is going to be our quote-unquote weapon. Okay, so let's take a look at how we configured this. So this spell fireball arc uses a projectile weapon script. And we've set the trigger mode to auto, so this means that the weapon will shoot continuously if the input is held down. In the case of the AI, it's when the ability is stopped. So you start it, it will shoot, and then you have to tell it to stop. If you do semi-auto, it automatically stops for you after each shot. We have delay before use and delay between use. You can change this to essentially have a delay between shots. Now, you can control this in the behavior tree as well, and I'll show that in a second. And let's take a look at... Yep, we're going to flip weapon on character flip. That's important. We don't need to do anything here. So we have animation events. So on weapon start. So basically this fireball spell won't start until the animation finishes. So we have an animation for the flayed. If we go back, we have an animation for the flayed minion that we want to configure. So if we go here, we have fireball body. That's the body. Let me go to full. He opens this up and it turns off, right? So when this turns on, this is when we want to start shooting, right? Probably right here. And then this is probably our loop right here. There actually isn't a loop here, so we'll see what we want to do with this. Maybe we'll do a single shot and then turn it off. That might work. With the none, it was actually a loop. This is the body, so maybe we could separate that somehow. Yeah, it really depends on how these animations are configured, but we'll see. So going back to our fireball spell. So we have wait for animation event, so it's going to wait for this on weapon start event to trigger. We'll have to configure that. And then we have the spell start and spell stop for the animation. So these are the names that are inside of the animator that tell the states to transition. So we'll get to that. We have start and stop feedbacks, which we are using to play sound effects. So that's cool. And we won't do anything for recoil. For projectile spawn, everything's good here. We have spread set to 45 and 5. So this will actually shoot 5 fireballs, and the spread is 45 degrees. So that's how that works. And then inside of this simple object puller, we actually set the fireball. So this is pointing to a projectile that we've already configured. And then, of course, we have the weapon aim script. So this is what the projectile agent communicates with. So we have that set to script because the projectile agent script is going to tell it what to do. And then rotation mode is free, which means it can aim at any angle. You can set this to 4 directions or 8. I'm going to keep it on free. And that's all we're going to do for that. So now, let's set this up. So on the Infinitive weapon handler, we're going to drag in so we're going to go to guns, fireball spell. We're going to drag this into the initial weapon. We'll apply this. And now we want to configure our animations. So going back to the weapon, our animation events are spell start and spell stop. So inside of here, we're going to set that up. So we have I'm going to move you. I'm not going to use the fireball body until we have other layers we need to worry about. So I'm just going to use the full. And I won't have to set this up for the other layers because we're just going to use this one. So we'll see if this works. So we're going to transition from idle to fireball full and then back to idle. So in here we're going to set this up and let's add a boolean called spell start, spell stop. we'll set this. So this will be spell start equals true. And then spell stop equals false. Nice. So this will shoot. And then inside of the animation, so taking a look at the flayed minion, we have an animation event that we need to call, right? The spell is waiting for on weapon start to play. So if we go to the none and we take a look at the... So on the bullet cast start, we have an event on weapon start. So we're going to do the same thing with this mage. So let's go to the fireball full. And then we want it to start right here. Now, the nun is using a automatic fireball spell, and it's also using a start, loop, and end animation. And in the loop, we just let it run until stop is called. We're going to use the same weapon and see what happens, but I don't think this is compatible with this animation setup because it just runs once and it's going to repeat, and it's just going to keep repeating. So we'll see what happens. We're going to add a animation event here, and we're going to call execute event. It's important that when you set this up that your character has an event handler. This is important. This is how we execute the event. So when we call this function from this list, it's actually coming from that event handler. And we're going to call on weapon start. And that lines up with the weapon that we were configuring. So going back to the fireball spell, that's a prefab. You'll see that this spell uses on weapon start, so it's going to wait for the animation event. Okay, cool. So the final thing we need to do is we need to set up the behavior tree. So currently this character does not shoot. So to test this quickly, we're just going to go into the behavior tree. Right now it wanders. We're going to make a new node. We're going to set this as start. And then we're going to call execute function. And then we're going to select from the infinitive weapon handler, we're going to call shoot start. And this will just keep calling shoot start. Let's give this a run and see what happens. Okay, so it is shooting, but the animation went away. Let's take a look at the mage. It went back to idle. And I think it's because we didn't set up the transition correctly. So let's take a look at that transition. So spell stop must be true. Okay, so that was what we did wrong. So spell stop is true. So if this becomes true, then it will stop and go back to idle. It was set to false, so it was just exiting automatically. And that's what I'm talking about. It's actually starting it twice, which is our problem. So let's see if we can fix that. So with the Razor Nun, we actually wanted to create a spell that was automatic, right? So looking at this projectile weapon, it's automatic, right? Which means that we can start it and then it must be stopped. And we're using it in a semi-automatic way. The animation doesn't support this type of function. So what we want to do is we want to duplicate this spell, and we're going to call this semi-auto, and we're going to change this to semi-auto. We'll swap that out on the minion under the infinitive weapon handler. And we'll give that a shot. So this means that the weapon will stop automatically. And you'll see that now it's consistently calling that. The audio is a little crazy, so let's fix that. So underneath the feedbacks, we have used. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Let's jump inside of here. The used feedbacks is playing this sound effect, so we're just going to remove that. And that should be a little better. Now, preferably it works just like the Razor Nun, but the animations are not configured for that correctly. Oh, and we've messed up the wrong one, so let me undo that. Okay, we added that back. This is the one we want to remove. And you'll see now it's doing everything correctly. Now, honestly, I think it should work more like the Razor Nun. So let's walk through how the Razor Nun works. So for the Razor Nun, we used what is called a substate machine. So if you right click, you can create a state, or you can create a substate machine. So I created a substate machine, and I named it Fire Spell. And what you can do is you can treat it like any other state, right? There's this entry point, so idle to Fire Spell. And this value, we're just going to split this over here so we can look at it side by side. This will trigger when spell start is set to true. And inside of here, this is the entry point, it will go immediately to this init state. And you can actually think of this as start spell. And you'll see it actually calls the start spell animation. And if we click on this and open it, you'll see that it actually will run through here, hit this event, and this event will tell it to execute on weapon start. This animation runs once, and then there's no condition, so it will transition over to the idle. And you can think of this as spell loop. Spell loop plays the idle animation for bullet shooting. And it will keep looping until spell stop becomes true. The final state is the end, so we'll call this spell stop, or stop. Yeah, stop spell sounds better. And this is the exit animation. If we click on this, in fact, we can actually take a closer look at how this looks here for the Nun. It looks just like this. So this is the character lowering his hand. This is our looping animation. And then we have start, which is it. If we go a little slower, he's raising his hand up. So raising his hand up, looping, and then raising his hand, or putting his hand down. And then of course it exits here, which comes out to the arrow here. It's kind of grayed out. That's because it's controlled by this substate, and it goes back to idle. Comparing that to what we just did, it goes into this animation once and then exits. And like I said, since spell stop has to be true for this to exit, it actually, the looping doesn't work, so automatic weapons is not compatible with this setup. You have to do a start, loop, and end sequence. So yeah, that is how you create a fireball spell and configure it in the behavior tree.